Good afternoon and welcome to today's Advocacy Ambassadors Network Wrap-Up webinar. I'm Catherine Hazelrig, the Assistant Director for Communications at CGS, and I'm subbing in for Kenneth. Today we have Beth Buellman and Lauren Inouye, and then Jerry Cooker from Rutgers University and Liz Watkins from the University of California, San Francisco on the line to talk to you. So this is not a formal presentation, but rather an interactive discussion conversation. I'm going to unmute your mic, but we ask that you please mute yourself unless you are providing comments or have questions. And as you do so, please introduce yourself and identify your institution to the group. If you have any technical issues, you can find help at the troubleshooting link on your screen. If you want to show or hide your webinar control panel, just click the orange arrow at the top left of the dashboard. If you're having audio problems, you can switch back and forth between either the telephone and the mic and speakers on your computer. You can do that at any point during the webinar without leaving the session. If you're on the phone and you're having trouble, if you click problem dialing in, you'll get an alternate phone number. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Beth.
Good afternoon. The goal, or several goals of this webinar are, one, to highlight the results of the recently fielded CGS Advocacy Ambassador Network survey, and to discuss the experiences that the current group of ambassadors had during their year as part of this network, and to sort of engage in a conversation about, if we were to do this again, and knowing what you now know, what would you have seen as things that were good experiences? What did we miss? How can we improve it? But then also to look ahead to the future and to begin to craft a way of keeping you engaged as alumni in a network. And so all of those things were the intent of this survey that we did in order to improve on what we called an experiment, or our pilot year, with the Advocacy Ambassador Network. To recap the survey, we basically sent it out to 34 Advocacy Ambassador Network members, and it was open for 2 weeks from April 20th through May 4th. We received 18 responses, and we have about, in the long run, about 10 people who are going to participate in this conversation, recognizing that one of the things that everybody said was timing and schedules, etc., made it difficult often to participate fully in every activity that we did. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Liz and Jerry, and have them talk a bit more about what's happened with the survey and the results that we received. Liz?
All right. Yes, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Terrific. Okay, so this slide shows the results of the question of with whom deans advocated over the past year. And I thought this was a really interesting result. Clearly, advocacy is understood quite broadly as part of the graduate dean's job, but perhaps not in ways that we would have anticipated. And I was really interested to see that 100% of the deans said that they advocate for graduate education with others on campus. And so let me just pause here and ask those of you in attendance if you could help shed some more light on this answer, and with whom were you advocating for graduate education on campus? Who's the audience? And please feel free to just shout out your answers.
For us, it was our budget committee.
The budget committee?
Yeah, we have a budget committee. We're trying to understand our what resources are needed to improve graduate education, and so a good deal of it has to do with educating people on what's necessary for quality graduate education and where where funding would make a difference and where it doesn't make a difference.
Okay, so Dave, that's who you were, that's who you advocated with, or at least were the voice for graduate education around that table.
Yeah, we also worked with academic senate as well. Utah's kind of unusual that we do not have a graduate assembly representing graduate students, and so we worked with both graduate students this past year as well as the academic senate to pass a legislation to form a committee to form a graduate assembly for graduate students so they can establish a voice on campus, because they really don't have one. They were just kind of small pockets of graduate students who are interested in issues associated with graduate education, but they don't have a common voice or a common meeting area. And so part of our challenge is actually establishing an advocacy group within the University of Utah which can represent graduate education with the students themselves.
That's great. Anybody else want to comment?
This is Karen Coates from the University of Southern Mississippi. I wouldn't say that my advocacy that I do with my campus is formal in terms of, my making an appointment to say I'm coming to advocate for graduate education. But what I do is I take lots of different opportunities to showcase graduate education on our campus. Well, for instance, the deans are invited to our president's executive cabinet at least a couple of times a semester, and I always take advantage of any opportunities that I have to talk about what we've done well, what's going on, and just anything that is, of significance that's going on with the graduate school or graduate education. The president, the provost, upper administration is very aware of directly from me.
Wow. That's oftentimes the goal, is to make sure that they know what's going on.
That's right.
Anybody else?
This is Ernest, University of Tennessee. Much of my efforts were equipping my dean with what she needed to be the champion. One thing that Howard Adams, a colleague of mine, made mention of, when it comes to advocacy, sometimes you need a big dog, and so you need a voice that's bigger than yours. So I tried to make sure that my dean had a loud bark when she was trying to advocate on our behalf, and much of those efforts were primarily to the provost as well as the chancellor.
So you enabled them to be able to advocate?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. The other thing I thought was interesting on this slide was that 3/4 of the respondents said that they advocated with other graduate deans. I thought we might try to unpack that a little more to understand what's the context for advocating with other graduate deans. Is that because there are common goals, or because you're part of a regional group, or through CGS?
Hey Liz, this is Marjorie. I'll bet that a lot of us were UC deans talking about going to the state capitol together.
Great. So working together on advocacy rather than advocating to each other.
Got it.
Yeah, that's how I interpreted it. It was
okay. Yeah. Oh, okay. So yeah, I can see what that would be. So going to your state legislature with a whole collective group for graduate education, with a whole collective group of graduate deans.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that leads me to my third question about this slide, which was fewer than 1/4 of respondents said that they had the opportunity to advocate on the federal level, and less than half advocated on the state level. And so I'm wondering what limitations there might exist for interactions with policymakers, especially on the federal level. And I guess what we'd love to know is, are folks feeling uncomfortable assuming that role, or unable to do so because of campus protocol?
This is Dave Key, the University of Utah. For us, we had to coordinate with our contacts in Washington, and so we had to work with them closely. So that it wasn't a problem, but you just had to follow the protocol. That was all.
Anybody else? Well, why don't we turn to the next slide, because I think the next slide is the companion about, if the previous slide was about the past, this one is about the future. And I think what's interesting about this too is that the largest group of who said that it would be unlikely for them to be advocating is on the federal level. So I'm just curious about the reasons for that. We heard from Dave saying that obviously there's protocol to coordinate with government relations in Washington. For some of us out in the west of the country, it may just be logistically difficult to get out to D.C., but I'd love to hear thoughts from others on this topic.
One of the things that I could suggest in terms of federal policymakers at least is to remember or consider working with district offices in the state. If indeed distance or coming to Washington is something that is difficult either due to travel restrictions or other types of restrictions or limitations, there are district offices that you can interact with and in fact get them to engage on your campus in a variety of different ways.
It's a really good idea and not one that I was thinking of very much, because I think of it as I got to add on another day in Washington and the expense and the logistics of it. And it would be much easier to be doing that, you know.
Okay, good.
Like,
For me, this is Dave Keita. For me, I did a lot of conference calling on mine. So we actually set up a meeting with staff. We'd exchange some ideas or slides or things like that, and we would just do a conference call because sometimes it's impossible to travel. But it seemed to work out pretty well. You got a lot of good feedback and a lot of from the staff, a lot of really good questions.
Good. Okay. Excellent. Anything else?
Yeah, this is Pushpa Murthy from Michigan Tech, and I would say it's the same reason. Another day, travel, coordinating to make sure you talk to the right people in Washington when you are there. And so just makes it all more difficult to work into the schedule. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, Gary, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Liz. So we're on slide 9 now, and the first comment I'd like to make is to thank all of you as part of the Advocacy Ambassador Network for your extensive engagement over this past year. Clearly we saw from this that you were very interested in most of the activities, most of the things that were provided as resources. And one general comment before we get in to break this down is that we did hear back from all of you that one of the major problems with your sometimes not being able to be involved in an activity is just the issues with scheduling. And we acknowledge that. You know, deans are very busy people. We've got multiple things that we all have to do, juggling balls all the time, and trying to find a particular time of day or day of week to schedule activities like this is just always going to be a challenge for us. Having said that, it's very clear from the data here that the CGS Web Resource webinar was the most well-received. And then half of you indicated that creating advocacy material was really powerful and impactful for you, and as was, of course, the orientation conference call. And working with government relations was also an important one. Perhaps we could spend some time unpacking that, because you clearly suggested to us that working with the government relations rep is important, and you wanted to learn about that. But at the same time, going back to what we just talked about when Liz was leading the discussion about the actual federal advocacy directly, there seems to be a bit of mixed message here. And I'm hearing from you that this may be just because you need to follow a protocol that's mandated at your university, as well as issues related to traveling to Washington. So perhaps we could spend some time commenting on these types of resources, if anybody would like to add anything more to that.
Hi, this is Mary Stromberger at Colorado State University.
Hi, Mary.
In terms of working with the federal representatives, one of the barriers we have is just the hierarchy here at CSU and who has access to our government liaison person. And that normally there's a chain of command that I have to go through, and I would not have access to my federal representative, but my provost would. So that would be the route I would have to take. So what I've been doing is forwarding advocacy talking points to my provost and asking my provost to talk with our government liaison person. I have much more access to our state representatives, and I work with the Graduate Student Council and a committee of the Graduate Student Council, the Science in Action Committee, and they are meeting with the state representatives annually now to discuss graduate education and research. But moving forward, what I also have discovered recently is that our Vice President for Research does have regular access to our federal government liaison person. And so there's a lot of overlap between my advocacy interests as well as the interests of the Vice President for Research. So moving forward, I will be working with the Vice President and partnering with him in our advocacy efforts.
Thank you. Mary, did you learn about that just, sort of accidentally, or did your provost inform you that that was your protocol?
Well, yeah, I used to be the chair of faculty council, so I would sit on the president's cabinet, and we'd have our cabinet meetings, and then our government liaison person would call in. But it was pretty clear from the formality of the relationship that of who has access to that person, and the chain of command to get access to that person.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And that's an important
Does anyone
to know.
Right, and I think that a comment similar to this had come up previously from one of the other members here, indicating that there is a really tightly regulated process that occurs at many universities that, you don't have, as a graduate dean, you might not have direct access, even to, not necessarily to speak to members of the delegation, but even to speak to your federal relations representative directly.
So what you do is you find out who does, and then you work with them, which is what you've done, Mary.
Yep, that would seem to be the case.
Yeah.
Now, if we
had a separate thing that showed up, which was we actually had to work with the university marketing and communication. So when I would draft something, I'd actually have to send it to them, and they would then copy edit it, and then it would go out to the representative for the institution representative in Washington. And so that way it was coordinated with the president's message and things like that. So that's something that I didn't really appreciate before, but the fact that you have to run, for us, we have to run it through media and communications as well. They scrub it.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand. I appreciate that. That's important that there be consistent messaging. We don't want to have people who appear to be talking against one another from the same university.
Yep.
Oh, yes,
Yeah, consistent message is important. Okay. Any other comments?
Okay. Any other comments from anybody on this particular slide? If not, we will move on.
This is
slide number 10.
One other thing would be that sometimes your government representative is representative of a system. So sometimes individual universities within that system might not get the messaging that they might want.
Yes.
That's
wow. And that is the case for your university, as I understand, right?
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. Okay.
Am I doing this?
Okay, then let's move on to slide number 10, and I think I'm going to turn it back to Beth.
Well, as we pointed out a couple of times, one of the things that seemed to be an issue and was a limitation in terms of people being able to participate in our activities was the time constraints, your schedules, meetings that you have, and recognizing that you're all busy folks. We felt that we had, good participation, and hopefully we can continue to have participation in activities going forward with the next cohort of advocacy ambassadors. But we're also going to be thinking about ways to better provide information after the fact. One of the things that we've done with the webinars is we've been able to send out the webinars after. We weren't able to do that with the topical conference calls, and we're looking for a possible approach that will allow us to send the recording of the phone call out after the phone call so that everybody benefits from the conversation of those who were able to participate at that actual time. We also said that 100% of all of you said that you'd recommend the webinars and that you would, again, recommend the orientation conference calls, and that 2 of the 3 topics seem to resonate with you all. So hopefully, as we go forward, we can better determine or better clarify some of the things that we're talking about in the topical conference calls so that you have a clearer understanding of what we believe is going to be discussed. And one of the conference calls, which is about campus resources, was probably the least attended and the least recommended going forward. And I'd like to get comments from you, if that's possible, as to what you thought or didn't think that was going to provide, and why it's not something that you would recommend going forward, if any of you were the ones that responded that you would not recommend it going forward.
I think that's slide 10, right, Beth?
Yes.
Well, actually, I think it's also slide 11 because it's the same topic there.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
It's okay. Because we are interested in finding out from the other members of AAN why this particular one was not rated as being useful, particularly since you had told us earlier in the survey results that connecting with campus people was important to you. Is it possible that the particular subtopics that we picked out here just weren't the right ones that were of relevance for you? Did anybody participate in this one? Maybe we don't have anybody on the line who did.
This is Karen Coates.
Hi, Karen.
This is from Southern Miss. I would certainly say it was a bad session or anything. It's just that I didn't get a lot of additional information from it. I was pretty much aware of most of what was covered, and I guess I just didn't find it that helpful.
Okay.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to comment on this? All right, hearing no comments then, I think we move on to slide 12, and I'll turn it back to Liz.
Thanks, Jerry. I think you can see from this slide that most of the respondents found most of the AAN activities to be helpful or very helpful to advocacy work. So we're glad about that. And I think what we want to do on the next slide is to ask some questions that will give us a little bit of a deeper dive into your experience as part of the AAN. So what you see here are responses that were given to the open-ended questions on the survey, and let's dig a little bit deeper. So for the first one, the comment about broader sharing of contact information and advocacy materials between those participating in the activities, I'm wondering if we did an opt-in sharing of email addresses, is that sufficient, or for whoever thought about this, or made or thought about this, or thinking about this comment, would you like a more organized interactions among the participants?
Usually more organized.
So I would take that to mean that providing the email contact information is...
It sounds like that's sufficient.
I
Yeah.
think that's good for me.
Okay. The second question I had, someone commented that having peer groups stay connected and remain accountable. I was wondering what was meant by accountability, if anyone on the call happened to make that comment. And I guess what I was trying to parse that out, I was wondering whether that meant that people would like to be accountable within the cohort or perhaps between cohorts, such as this inaugural cohort and the next one that we'll bring on starting in the summer.
Can you hear me now? This is Kevin Miller. Can you hear me?
Yes. No. Now we can.
Okay. I didn't mention this one, but the idea of having peer groups to stay connected, I think, is a good one. I don't know about this remaining accountable to the network. I don't know what that means either. But I do think that having a group of people in like institutions, like situations, that can talk to each other, and even having other individuals, they got similar kind of issues or concerns, that's a good idea. And I think you do get that, though, in a discussion group to some extent, where you can put problems out there or things out there to talk about. So I think some of that's addressed a little bit, but still having peer groups like places would be a good idea.
Thanks, Kevin. So I'm just following on what you just said. I'm wondering then, would you find it more helpful if instead of organizing the orientation conference calls by region, would it be more helpful to have them organized by type of institution so that then that group is introduced to each other and then can stay connected?
From my standpoint, being a comprehensive, yes, because when we get into a lot of the stuff that people are really looking at, a lot of focus on doctoral programs and doctoral students, and research with doctoral students, and taking their doc students to the state capitol and stuff like that. That's great, and I think that's fantastic stuff that people are doing, but it has limited relevance to the type of situation we're in. I know you can glean things from it, but having peer groups that are similar in nature and structure to try to work through some of these things would be interesting.
That's a helpful comment. Thank you. Okay, the third one about more frequent inclusion of graduate students as both participants and presenters. When we were discussing this on a prep call earlier this week, I have to confess that I didn't know that graduate students could be included. So I am delighted to hear this. I'm a big fan of bringing graduate students in. And so one of the things that we'd like to know is how should CGS better communicate this information in terms of just enabling graduate students to listen in on these webinars and calls. But then going a little bit further, do you all have any thoughts on how we might engage graduate students as presenters so that we can learn from each other's graduate students about their experiences and how better to advocate for them and to train them to be advocates for graduate education?
Hi, everyone. I think that, hi. I think that that's an excellent suggestion. I'm doing great. Perhaps we can consider contacting the leaders or the exec board for each of the graduate student organizations and asking them from our institutions and asking them if they would be open to joining this, to joining conference calls or presenting, because they have a better sense of what's going on the campus because they're part of the student organization leadership.
Hi, this is Mary again at Colorado State, and I was just wondering if, if CGS could partner with the National Association of Graduate Professional Students on some events, like whether or not it be at a CGS meeting or a webinar.
I think that'd be the best way to go.
This is Jerry Kukor at Rutgers. I mean, I just happened to be at meeting DC where there was a presentation from one of the board members of NAGPS, and boy, I'll tell you, this was fabulous. Engaging with them with a group of the Council on Federal Relations was very informative for us, and because they represent such a large constituency throughout the country, because they have regional chapters, and they've tackled many big topics over the last couple of years. I agree. They're a powerful voice.
So this is Pushpa Murthy from Michigan Tech University. We've taken students and posters to Lansing so the students are there to present their work and on what we call Graduate Education Day. So students are there talking about their research work, and that has been good. We picked the students from those who won local competition on our campuses. So they were already, in some sense, tested and proven to be good, I guess. But this year for us in Michigan, the legislature, as you can imagine, is all about Michigan State and the problems at Michigan State. So we decided not to do anything this year and wait for the fall or the spring. But fall is election time, to wait for the spring for all of us to go to Michigan State and advocate for grad education here. The other point I wanted to make when you're talking about sharing information, what I thought would be useful is those of us who started off in the orientation, the first webinar, it would be useful if we would share with the group what activities we were engaged in as they occurred on our campuses, to just send an email to the group and say, yep, we did this and this worked or didn't work or something like that. Not to take too much time, but to just share that actually activity and experience.
That's great. Thank you.
Jerry, you want to take the next few?
Yes, actually, Pushpa, thank you, because that's a wonderful segue into the bullet point number 4, which we heard from you, which is to publish tips and takeaways after each of the sessions, which, I thought this was such a wonderful suggestion. I don't know who made it, but to me, this is sort of capturing the nuggets, the things that came out from each session, publishing them right away, and then circulating them, which is sort of the reciprocal of what Pushpa just said about, the deans themselves talking about what their particular issues are. This sort of goes hand in glove, one with the other. Would anybody like to comment more, perhaps even the author of this comment, if you're on, what you might have had in mind there that we could help with at the CGS level?
Jerry, this is Beth. One of the things.
Hey, Beth.
One of the things that might work here is, and it goes back to this whole notion of accountable, and it sort of builds on what Pushpa was saying, is for those individuals who participate in either the webinars or the topical phone calls, if they have a key takeaway or nugget from their perspective as a grad dean, whether they're at a comprehensive institution or at an R1 institution, to then share it with the group, as opposed to necessarily just one person doing that, because I think people take different things from the conversation. And so maybe that's one of the ways that they also can be accountable to one another, is to say, hey, this is what I heard and this is what I think about how I'm going to use it on my campus. So, that's another twist on this whole notion of tips and takeaways.
Yep. Excellent. Thank you, Beth. Anybody else care to comment on this one? If not, then we can move on to the next to the last bullet here, which is really related to what other webinars or topics should be included, because this is looking towards the future. We had a mixture of things for this first year. You all are now alumni of the program. But what would you like to see going forward? What would you recommend that would be useful from your perspective that would be for the next cohort, assuming we get a group that comes in for doing this for next year? So are there any other suggestions out there? Things that are of interest to you?
I think you guys hit on most of the topics that are the high flying or the big topics.
Okay, that's good to know.
One suggestion that was made was that the webinar on advocacy materials be presented earlier in your year. Is that something that you think would have been helpful?
I'm not sure that it would have mattered for me. I thought it was helpful material. It's
Okay.
I didn't want everything right at the beginning.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Okay, got it, got it. All right, and then the last bullet point here, and I think this is a theme that's been running through this whole webinar, is related to working with your state lawmakers. I mean, I understand from what I've heard from all of you now that there are some restrictions, constraints, boundary conditions for working at the federal level. Many of you seem to indicate that you have much more immediate and direct contact and want to have that direct contact with your state lawmakers. And it sounds like there's a desire to get a bit more information that would be helpful for you there. CGS, of course, has information on its website for graduate school deans. So maybe what we could do is ask you to comment on what more you would like to learn that could be helpful to you for working with state lawmakers. Is there basic information you need from CGS, or is this, do you want to form a community of practice? Again, we talked about that earlier, about peer groups working with one another. Is that what you're looking for in terms of strategies for being effective in working with state lawmakers?
This is Kevin. I think there's two distinct, as I see it, maybe differences. Working with federal lawmakers, you're working on some overarching policy and usually grants and allocation of discretionary funding. Your state lawmakers are your purse string. They're the ones that actually do the things that are directly related more so in many ways like graduate assistantship. They're the ones that help highlight some of that stuff, or if you have some kind of fellows program and stuff like that. So there's a difference in the advocacy and the purpose of the advocacy, as I see it, between the state lawmakers and your federal lawmakers. And I think what's happened is we have a lot of focus on the federal, the big idea, big picture, how do we go after certain discretionary funding, how do we report an event on certain kinds of things. That's good for the whole of everything. And then we got competitions that kind of feed into that, although we're also being very cognizant of policies around international students that affect us as well. Our purse strings, though, are coming from our state lawmakers.
That's an important point, Kevin. Thank you for that. And so if I could just jump in and follow, because we talked previously about engaging graduate students in this and, the whole NAGPS or any other advocacy body. If I follow through with that, of course, me being at a state university too, the way in which you present and engage with your students and engage with your legislators at the state level, you're going to be telling not necessarily totally different stories, but you're going to be putting things on that are of greater relevance to what a particular member of a district is interested in at the state level versus what's going on for somebody at the federal level. Is that, am I speaking correctly there from your perspective at Buffalo?
Yeah, that's a distinction I see. And I'm at Buffalo State, which I'm going to go talk to some lawmakers or something like that, potentially. And the University of Buffalo, which is more of an R1 university center, is going to talk with a different set of things about the Western New York region as well. So you got to, and looking at how you're advocating for things and working with state lawmakers also depends upon the type of institution you're at and what kind of graduate programs you have versus if you have doctoral programs. If I have doctoral programs, I have a whole different approach than I do as just comprehensive.
Yep, absolutely. Understood. Thank you. Anybody else care to comment on the issue of working with state lawmakers?
This is Pushpamurthy from Michigan Tech. So I thought one thing that CGS did this year, which could only have been done at the federal level, was when the grad students' tuition was going to be taxed, and that they helped mount a serious advocacy. Of course, many organizations did, but CGS also did and stayed on top of it and kept us informed so we could pass it on to our students here. and AAUP and some others sent us some placards and things maybe we could paste on different bulletin boards on campuses and that. I thought that was very important advocacy and very useful, and it was good to know that CGS was there arguing this point for us, as well as communicating back to us in a timely manner what was going on. That, of course, would not have been very useful with the state lawmakers, so I'm not speaking to exactly the point, but I wanted to say that some aspects which can be particularly effective are those that can only happen in Washington. This whole issue of visas for international students and all of that stuff that's going on, I don't know what we can do. But again, it's not something we can advocate at the state level, but again, CGS has a very big role to play in that, and just keeping us informed is also very useful for us, so we can then transmit that information on our campuses. So I do look to CGS for those sorts of advocacy and information.
Great, Pushpa, that's good to hear. Thank you. Okay, then let's move on to slide 14, and Liz, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Jerry. So here are some additional topics that have come up either from the survey but also from the mind of Beth and Lauren at CGS. And so I'd just like to get a sense of what are some of the tools and resources and relationships that you might need to help achieve these goals. That is to say, what can CGS offer from that position, and what can we sort of offer as a community of deans to each other to help learn how to engage more broadly with these different audiences and in these different venues?
I like the list you got up there. You were just commenting about the last slide that had the state stuff on there, about the need to also look at local, the community, the region and regional folks, because they also actually can help out in advocating to the state level, but also we got to make sure we're meeting the regional need.
Mm-hmm.
You're absolutely right. And I've been looking very closely at this, working with alumni. Tomorrow starts our all alumni weekend, reunion weekend. So I'm very mindful of getting the message out about what's going on in graduate education, how alumni can become more involved in terms of networking with each other, but also serving as mentors to grad students, and then, of course, giving back in a philanthropic way.
Yeah. And Jerry, yesterday you were talking about some institutions you can develop your own alumni committee, but with other campuses that's not necessarily a possibility. And what would you suggest?
Well, actually, that's an excellent point, Beth, and I wanted to bring that up because that gets back to the same issue we talked about before relative to federal relations. I know at some universities you're free as a graduate dean to connect and establish your own alumni network. That's certainly what I do here at Rutgers, but I'm well aware of the fact that at other universities, connectedness to alumni is through often your alumni relations office, which often will report to at the level of a provost or a chancellor, and deans may not have the degree of freedom. And so I would be interested in knowing from the people who are on the conference call, what's the environment in which you're working if your goal is actually to begin to work with your graduate school alumni?
This is Ernest, University of Tennessee. The one advantage I have is that my wife works for the UT Foundation. So I have a direct link that way. But one thing I have found that benefited us, I was able to get information on the number of alums that had graduated from graduate programs from the University of Tennessee, and how many were actually working within the state of Tennessee. So as we continue to try to make this push for workforce development and impact, it says a lot when I'm interacting with a legislator and say, well, these these are the number of graduate students from the University of Tennessee that are currently in the workforce within the state. And demonstrating that we need to increase that.
Excellent, excellent. And probably an extension of that would be those who came from someplace else and studied at the University of Tennessee and remained within the state. So there's this importation effect there too.
Yes.
Thank you very much for that. Is there anybody else who'd like to comment on the issue of working with alumni?
This is Pushpa Murthy, and we work with the advancement office. It's been a pretty smooth relationship. So before I go to meet alumni, either here in the U.S. or in other parts of the world, mostly Asia, I do stay in touch with them. They give me a list. They also help me sometimes with some of the, sending emails and things like that. If they perceive the donors to be really big donors, maybe, people who have already contributed millions and they see them as potentially contributing, to name a school or something like that, then they have warned me and said, don't ask because you might end up asking for too little. We think they can give more. And so I kind of tend to then ask them a little bit more information about, okay, what is more? What can I ask and not ask? So it's been a good relationship. They haven't told me to not approach anybody, only even if you approach this person, we are waiting to make the big ask, so just be careful. That's sort of guidance they have given me. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Pushpa. Okay, should we move on to slide 15 then, please? I think Lauren's going to cover this.
Yes, yes. So the question was, how willing are you in the future to facilitate each of the following types of AAN or CGS advocacy-related activities? So the three activities that were listed were participating in the CGS meetings, which of course are the summer workshop and the annual meeting, conference calls, and webinars. An encouraging thing is that if you look at all three categories, around 3/4 responded either willing or very willing to participate. What we'll plan to do in the future is that internally from AAN members who responded that they would be interested in being a part of an AAN alumni group, and I think in this light we'll be able to really help showcase the members as the stewards of CGS's advocacy and as the advocates of graduate education to give more of that peer-to-peer exposure in our advocacy opportunities. Okay, and I'm going to pass it off to Beth.
And as Lauren pointed out, we got a very strong interest in people being part of an AAN alumni group, and I liken this to the dance classes that I've had, where you have a beginner class and then you move to the intermediate and the advanced class, and you don't necessarily get the same things in the intermediate and advanced class, but you get either a deeper dive, or you expand your technique, or you refine your technique in a way that you might not have been able to as a beginner in these efforts. And so one of the things that we are going to do is everybody that was part of this first cohort of advocacy ambassadors, we will be receiving soon an email recognizing that you are still our first cohort until the summer workshop. You'll be receiving an email to opt into an alumni group. And with that, we will also be thinking about how we can continue the engagement of you as part of this alumni group in some of the things that you mentioned you wanted to do, such as mentoring colleagues, and that goes back to the peer-to-peer kind of effort. Continuing to receive the policy alerts, such as Pushpa mentioned with respect to the tax issues. Facilitating future AAN activities, In this past year, we relied on the ACAP members, the Advisory Committee on Advocacy and Public Policy, to facilitate these activities. And so if you indicate in your response back about wanting to be part of this alumni network, if you could let us know specifically what things, given you now know what we talk about in the first year, what kinds of activities you would be interested in facilitating. And then finally, participating in future activities around the network. And I think that we received a very positive response with respect to wanting to be part of the alumni network. And so, as I pointed out, we will be sending a notice to you asking you, one, to opt into the alumni network, and my expectations going forward for Lauren are that about a third to a half of you will probably want to continue to be part of the alumni network, and then we will really try to dig a little deeper in terms of what that means and how we can facilitate that, and at the same time offering to the next cohort of AAN the kinds of activities that we offered you in this first go-round. So just be on the lookout for that from Lauren and Kenneth, and we certainly hope that to the extent you can, you will opt in and continue to be engaged in advocacy efforts. So with that, I will turn it back over to, well, Liz and Jerry for closing remarks.
Jerry, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, first thing is to thank all of you as members of the first Advocacy Ambassador Network. Of course, I hate to say it, but you're the guinea pigs. This was the first time through to see if this was going to work, and from my perspective, it worked remarkably well. It was marvelous. We've developed a group that has strong interest and was persistent in here and came forth with great ideas. I think from this wrap-up, we're learning a tremendous amount. There's a lot of nuance out here that we weren't necessarily aware of at the beginning that's going to help going forward. So I think Cohort 2 gets to profit from the experience of Cohort 1, but then you also have matured as a group. And so if there is, as Beth said, an interest on your part in becoming part of the Cohort number 1 alumni network and extending your activities from there, then we would want to continue to work with you. So I just want to say thank you to all of you for your valuable input. It certainly has been something where I have learned a tremendous amount in this process. And Liz, to you?
I'd like to thank Beth for initiating this program. It was her idea. She brought it to fruition. She shepherded it through, and it's become a real thing. And I'm excited for Lauren to be able to take it on into next year. So thank you, Beth, for all the hard work that you and your team did in getting this organized. For the AAN, I'd like to encourage you all to use the network as a community of shared interest and as a sounding board for ideas or problems. I think sometimes CGS can seem like a very big organization with 600 members, but we find these smaller communities of shared interest around advocacy, around similar-sized organizations or institutions with similar needs. So I hope that you'll continue this, whether formally as part of the alumni group or just informally, having met each other on these calls and in these webinars. And finally, I just wanted to say that if additional thoughts occur to you about the network, both how to operate it for the alumni, but also what we can do to make it even more impactful and meaningful for the next cohort, please feel free to email Jerry or me, or to find us at CGS. We'll both be at the summer workshop in New Dean's Institute. So we'd love to hear your additional thoughts.
Lauren?
Agreed. Absolutely.
This is Lauren. I just wanted to say that I am very, very excited to be on board with CGS. Really look forward to working with you, Liz and Jerry, and the rest of the ACAP and AAN members. It has been truly an honor to be able to learn from Beth over the past month. Very sad to see her go. But in talking with Beth yesterday about kind of reflecting on the past 5 years that she's been in CGS, one of the things that she noted is that helping others find their voice in advocacy is really her passion. I think this is a prime example of the success that she's had in doing that here. So happy and very excited to continue to carry the torch.
And this being my last hour of my last day at CGS, I wanted to thank all of you for taking the risk and the chance to participate in this network. And one of the things that, to echo what Lauren said, was it's helping graduate deans find their voice, helping them see the skills that they already have, and refining them in a way that helps others understand the importance and the value and the contribution that graduate education makes to the total overall mission of the institutions in which you work. I was pleased to see that advocacy is now seen in a much broader light and from a broader perspective, which I think ultimately can only serve the graduate education community, can only benefit the graduate education community. And I just want to say that the 5 years that I've been at CGS have been wonderful, and I feel that I'm leaving it in good hands, and particularly with Jerry and Liz as part of the ACAP, but also knowing that we have a group of advocacy ambassadors that will carry it even further. And so I encourage you to continue your efforts in this way and be the voice that we need for graduate education. And just one point that I need to encourage you to submit a story to Grad Impact, because that's another way that we get the message out about graduate education and the important work that our students are doing in our institutions around a number of issues that are important to society, research, and innovation. So thank you all.
Thank you.
This is Marcia.
And Beth, congratulations to you as you move to the next phase of your career.
Yes, and I also want to second that. Thank you, Beth, a lot for helping us in the last 5 years to become better advocates, and wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Beth. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, I think